Welcome to the last day of session, because tomorrow we have the student work presentation. And it's a pleasure to introduce you as first speaker, Rajat Mani Thomas. Rajat is a distinguished faculty member in Artificial Intelligence and Weill Cornell Medicine in Qatar. He leads the Thomas Lab in Artificial Intelligence in Healthcare, where his team focuses on translation of the AI developments alongside major hospital in Qatar. Holding a PhD in computational astrophysics, first area of Professor Thomas. Later, he started to work in the area of medicine, and he's the author of well-recognized publication and papers in different areas, first in the area of astrophysics, and now neuroscience, machine learning, and the application to clinical aspect of in medicine. His talk is today. We have two talks in the healthcare area, and this is a talk with the equilibrium between the foundation and the application healthcare. It's very important to understand how to use and to apply artificial intelligence for a responsible way in the area. Thank you very much. Rajat, a pleasure.
Thank you, and good morning, buenos dias. I'm sorry if I'm a bit slow in the morning, because last night we got hammered. It's amazing. What's a Milno? It's a great beer from Alhambra, so I overdid it. But feel free to stop. I want this to be as interactive as possible, all right? There is no schedule. As you can see on the top right, I have 37 slides. By no means I want to get to the end of it. If we get, it's good. But it's more important for you to sort of understand why I'm doing this. So I'm not going to give you a bunch of facts. What I'm trying to do here is to help you think along in different ways, give you different perspectives about how to think about healthcare. So my talk is divided into two halves. The first is the application of how do you think about AI in healthcare. And this was the topic that they asked me to speak about. And then the second half, we will go into a bit of the mathematics, in fact, the geometry of machine learning models, and to use that intuition for people interested in doing research in AI to think about these kind of representational spaces. All right? Let's get started. So is anybody here working in healthcare? Not too bad, with 3, 4, 5. Okay, sort of. So what do you think? Is AI in healthcare hype or reality? Because that's the question we need to answer, yeah?
I would say for me that it's hype.
A hype. Yes?
I think it's a mix of both.
Mix of both. I have my answer, and my answer is it's reality. Now you can go home. It's done. This is the answer. No more. Okay? Yeah. So I will argue why it's a reality in terms of certain aspects, and why it hasn't given us the ROI we have expected, and why does it feel like it's mostly hype. All right? And start with this fact. You know, medical knowledge is doubling faster than ever before. So in the 1950s, it took like 50 years for all medical knowledge in history to double. Now, already in 2020, every literally 2.5 months, the amount of literature, amount of work published, this is published work in the field of medicine is doubling. So you like it or not, if you go to your GP, and your GP was graduated 15 years ago, the amount of knowledge that he misses is basically 2 to the power of 12, 1,000-fold. He has missed out on it. How do you expect anybody to be at the forefront of healthcare, at the forefront of medicine, if this is the rate at which knowledge is being expanded? So hype or not, you cannot do it without AI, period. You cannot do it without the assistance of information integration. So if you talk about LLMs, what does it actually do? It sort of compresses most of the world's knowledge into a few weights, a few billion weights in a model, right? And you need that sort of help, that sort of companion brain next to you to make any sense. Otherwise, what's the point of those knowledge doubling? Because as you know, healthcare and your health in general is not isolated, right? You are a system, and in order to think like a system, you need to integrate all information that comes to the system, right? If you have a problem with your gut, that can affect the way your brain functions, right? If you have a problem with oral hygiene, that can affect your brain and your heart. So if you're a cardiologist and know nothing about the gut, or if you are a neurologist and know nothing about oral hygiene, we have a problem. And specializations today taught in medical schools like Weill Cornell or any other places are still siloed. After the first few years, you specialize. So it's very difficult to sort of bring all of that knowledge together. So even if it's a hype now, you can't do without it. So what is top? Why does it feel like it's not giving us the return? It's not the technology. So my argument for this talk is that it's very, very little to do with technological advances. It's more to do with people relations. It's more to do with sort of the sociology, okay? Now we'll go into that and figure out why. And we will see that there are 6, we could name more, but I come up with 6 major problems why it's not adopted. First of all, let me just tell a little bit of history, right? I got into AI when I was doing my postdoc in Toronto, and I was very lucky to be in Toronto in 2012. How many people know what happened in Toronto in 2012? You are at the end of a machine learning summer school. 2012 should be a very important year that you should remember. So, AlexNet, yes, indeed. So 2012, AlexNet, which is a computer vision model, beat every other model by a huge margin in something called the ImageNet competition. That is often referred to as a watershed moment when it comes to machine learning and computer vision. And I was across the street from Jeff Hinton, who won the Nobel Prize last year, and his students, and we used to share the same canteen, talk about these things. And we knew something happened in 2012, right? And it was only a few of us. I got excited, so I left astrophysics, started to pursue neuroscience and machine learning from then on. So 2012 to now is 14 years. So you have to remember, it takes time, any technology, it takes quite some time to get adopted. And if you think about it, AI has done an incredible job in actually penetrating a lot of the industries and even healthcare so quickly. Healthcare is a very, very stubborn sort of domain to infiltrate because of many of these problems, okay? So AI is making a huge impact directly or indirectly. So these are the 6 gaps that we will go into in a little bit detail, right? And see that if we solve these problems, which are not AI technology-based problems, okay? They could be software engineering problems, they could be infrastructure problems, but not AI problems. So first thing is clinicians' workflow. So some of you say, in the lab we built an amazing model, 95+% accuracy, better than any clinicians. Okay, great. Then you give it to the clinicians, they don't even look at it. That's why. He said, I have work to do, right? Like, they are busy. They're busy like crazy. They have their set workflow. They have been trained in the medical school to be laser focused on what they do, and they keep doing that task over and over. And after doing that task for like 10 years, if you say, oh, no, it's just one more app, open that app, it'll be so cool. You can know everything about this person with the ECG. It's like, I know what I need to do. It's very difficult. They're very stubborn clinicians, right? So sometimes you have a great model, but you show it to the doctor at the wrong time. And we have done these trials. They don't bother with it. You have built an app or some kind of technology for the nurse. They are interrupted every 6 minutes. What are you going to do? Ask them to use your AI app and say, okay, if you keep using this, you will save time 1 month from now. They will not bother, right? So, you see, this is Amsterdam Academic Medical Center, where I was a faculty member there. When we piloted AI tools, within a week, most of the clinicians stopped using it. All right? Not because the tool was bad. Okay? Let's see if this works. This is a clinician who, this is a cardiologist from Mayo Clinic. So Mayo Clinic in the US is probably the most advanced hospital using AI. They have their own AI team, AI infrastructure team, GPUs, which is unheard of in most hospitals. So this is the most advanced hospital. And he's going to tell you a little bit, just a minute, about what they did. So this is, for those of you who don't know, what you're seeing here on the chart are ECG signals. All right, so you put probes on your body, and it measures your heartbeat in different channels. Okay, and looking at this, the cardiologist can say a few things. Okay, whether there is any issue with the heart, ventricular malfunction, and so on and so forth. But obviously, the AI, when it looks at this chart, can say a lot more than any clinician can ever say. Okay, in fact, you'll see here all the stuff that it can say. But nobody was using it. Nobody was using it, even though it was the coolest app they've ever seen. But now, what this guy does, let's see if this plays.
With AI technologies. And let me show you how we look at an ECG now. So if you went into my EPIC chart, this is my chart of de-identified or descriptive of anything too interesting. But if you click here under the results viewer tab and bring up cardiology, what we've done is created this separate viewer at Mayo Clinic called the AI ECG dashboard. And what it does is opens up a separate viewer, and then all of the AI models that we've developed over the past several years are then run on all of the ECG data that are available for that individual patient with a single sign-in. So it's created this very interactive dashboard for people to explore these kinds of data. And you recall my ECG basically said normal ECG, but when we look at the AI models, you can see that it estimates.
So, a few things I want to note. That chart that you see is called EPIC. EPIC is one of the biggest sort of electronic health record provider. So there's Cerner, there's EPIC, these are the big names. So cardiologists were not using it. These guys have been developing models for the last 6, 7, 8 years that have been working perfectly, but none of the clinicians used it. The only change they did was to put a little button there on EPIC, on the software they already use. And now you say, oh, there's a button in the software you use. If you press, you'll get information. Boom. Most of the clinicians started using it. A little change. That's not AI. That's user design. So that is user-centric design. Nothing to do with the AI technology existed for the last 5 years on the same thing, and it could have saved lives. Yet, it was not used. So now I think, where is the hype, right? So, and what it can do is crazy things that no clinicians can do. It can tell you your biological age quite accurately. So there's a distinction between your biological age and your chronological age. And that's becoming a big issue when you talk about longevity, how healthy you are. So if I take your heart signals and put it through this AI, it'll tell you, are you a 40-year-old with a 30-year-old heart or a 25-year-old with a 40-year-old heart, right? And that discrepancy is a signal for clinicians to take a good look at you. You shouldn't be too much off. I mean, if you're younger, great. I mean, you're doing something amazing. But unfortunately, oftentimes, They are a bit older, and that's not good news, right? It can tell you if it's a male or female. It's not very important, maybe nowadays, but and the probability of low EF, ejection fraction, these are just impossible for doctors to say. And this was not being used at all, not because the model was not there, but because it was not actually placed into the workflow of the clinicians. So what we do sometimes now is the final year students of medicine now another interesting shift that's happening is that the medical students nowadays, the young folks like you, are getting a lot into AI. So the future doctors, this is just one generation away, will be much more AI savvy and tech educated. So there will be a shift coming soon because of the new demography that's going to come. The doctors now, like 50 plus, very difficult to get them to change stuff, right? So now, so what we ask the students to do is to follow the doctor. So as AI scientists, engineers, we don't know. We're not doctors. So I've got many students to just follow the doctor like a shadow. Of course, we take the doctor's permission. We don't want to be creepy. So we follow the doctor, and there is a sheet that you fill up, very detailed. How, what does he or she spend his time on here? How much time paperwork? How much time looking at patients? Some sad statistics come out of that. So doctors spend a lot of time doing unnecessary paperwork than looking at patients. We cut off the time they take for coffee and stuff. But so that was the first gap. Okay, not understanding the user who actually needs to use it. All right. So remember, question.
I have a small question
Yeah.
about this gap, and it's, I get the point that the doctors may be reticent to change their workflow to adopt new technologies, and so the AI should be integrated already into the workflow. But the thing is, like, by keeping that workflow, you can do as much. Have you tried to convince doctor to say, look, this is going to be better? Maybe it's worse at the beginning, the first 2 weeks, but you will get used to it, you will get faster, or they are just too stubborn?
Yeah, you have not spoken to many clinicians. If you know them, they are clinicians come in different flavors. The worst are neurosurgeons. Okay, the worst. They think they are very close to God. And even cardiologists, radiologists are becoming a little bit more amenable. It's not easy because, and I think that's the way it should be. They are very confident about everything they do, which is good when it's a doctor. So you train to be like that. So when you say that we're going to show you a better way to do your job, that doesn't go down well. All right? And especially coming from somebody like me, he said, what did you do again? I said, I'm an astrophysicist. He's like, go out this way, please, all right? So it's not easy, but we are slowly, that's social engineering a little bit, right? So to get them to like you first.
So what is your view on the opposite side of things, in which they might actually over-rely on AI in the future? Because you talk about the shift, right?
Yeah,
so that goes a little bit too much.
Yeah, so that is a genuine concern. Actually, there's a startup that's doing an interesting job. So, for example, radiology, they're doing a lot of AI in imaging in radiology. So one company did the following. So looking for lung nodules. They're looking at it, and once in a while, the AI, or the software, not AI, will make a mistake on purpose and see if the doctor catches it, if he's sleeping or not. If he doesn't, it'll raise an alarm, right? Saying, okay, wake up. This was actually it. So you build in such kind of little tricks to wake the doctor up. But there will be a time, I'm almost sure, a lot of these workflows will be very automated. Very automated. With all due respect to a lot of the specialists, it's pattern recognition at the end. So it's a matter of time. But we need the doctors for other reasons, because patients are humans, so we need a human to interact with the patient, right? So the second big gap is infrastructure. If you go to any normal hospital, I'm not talking about Cleveland Clinic or Mayo Clinic and places like this. If you go to any normal hospital, they don't have GPUs, they don't have a cluster, they don't have an IT team that is capable of running inference at any sort of scale. They won't know what inference is. So that's a problem, okay? Because as you know, in medicine, you can't just send the data to OpenAI or Claude or whoever it is that you want to send your data to. There's all kinds of privacy laws. Here in Europe, you have all kinds of GDPR laws, and you have HIPAA. All these prevent you from sending your data, sometimes out of the country, which is lenient, sometimes out of your hospital. So what do? You need to do all the AI you can inside the walls of your hospital, and that is sometimes problematic. Again, not the AI is not the problem. We do have solutions. So I don't know how many of you recognize these things? Yes, exactly. So these two are the DGX Spark. DGX Spark is about, in the Middle East, about $4,000 each. It's not very expensive. And what you see in the bottom is like the Mac Studio. You can run pretty good sized LLMs. If you combine two of the top ones together like that, you can run a 400 billion model LLM on it locally, right? So such solutions are coming to the market. So we can run models now. So that's one in terms of the infrastructure. And secondly, there's a lot of improvements in the way we design models and distill models, that we can quantize them as well in a way that it can run on this very reliably and very fast and very locally. So it is possible, but if I go in with this thing to the hospital, the IT folks will not like me either. So now the clinicians don't like me and the IT folks don't like me. So this is also challenging. So it's again about convincing people what is important, what's not. Okay. So third one, people don't talk about sometimes. You have a cool AI model, everything can be done. But the patient, and you need to be transparent that we'll be using AI for your diagnosis. And because of all the social media attention to AI and so on, the patient will be like, no, thank you. Please do not use any AI on my data or to do any diagnosis on my thing. What do? They get the vote, so you can't say, forget it, I'm going to use it, right? Which is sort of weird because why not? So there are people who argue, oh, they won't go into the MRI scanner because they are scared of closed spaces. So we do a bunch of things to either make them sleep or get them accustomed to that to get an MRI scan. So the question is, what do we do to get these patients to rely? But luckily, at least in the US, it seems like a lot of people are okay with it, but still, not all of them are. So this is an interesting study that did the following. So it told a bunch of patients that the AI we are going to use on you is operating at the specialist level. It's just verbal, okay? No. It's operating at the specialist level. Then you had a 32% increase over the baseline of people who said, okay, go ahead and use AI. Then the experiment, it was all hypothetical, right? So they didn't actually use the AI. They asked, what if we use the AI at a GP level? Then only like 25% more said, okay. What I find funny is this one, the last one. They say, we'll use AI, but there will be a clinician in the loop looking at this as well. People didn't trust as much. Okay, people seem to have preferred a totally like specialist level AI. So these things also has to be learned before we go full on deploying things. Okay? So now you see why that hype in AI has not been realized yet, right? There are all of these issues. This is a big issue. It's a boring issue. I hate this because, okay, you deploy it, patients agree to that, Everything is in place, but the insurance company says, "Oh, we didn't sign up for that." What is the CPT? So, okay, little bit of economics, healthcare economics. CPT is like procedural codes. That means that you go to a doctor, a diagnosis with something, then it gives you an injection. That's a procedure. And that injection has a code. That code is sent to the insurance, and the insurance says, okay, I know what that is. Boom, you get reimbursed. There are almost no codes available for AI-based. So you use AI to detect something. All right, so for example, you use AI to detect that he will have sepsis in like 4 hours, which is very, very dangerous to have. And you treat them now. Then the insurance is like, why did you treat for sepsis? He didn't have sepsis. But he says he's going to have sepsis. Like, how do you know he's going to have sepsis? So those codes are still not there yet. Okay? So even everything is working, if you don't get paid, I know it sounds like terrible, so you're actually saving people's life, but the question comes back from the insurance asking, how do you know the life was in danger? Right? You have to tackle those questions. So that's also a bit of an issue. RCTs, how many of you know about RCTs? RCTs stand for randomized controlled trials. So anytime you have a new drug that needs to be tested, it goes through different phases, right? Clinical trial. You have animal trials first, then you have clinical trials 1, 2, 3. And there what happens is that you have a group, you divide it into 2, they're all matched. To one you give the real medicine, the other you give some placebo. See if there is any change, any substantial change, and you approve the medicine and so on. If you think of AI as a tool to either run some diagnosis, prognosis, or treatment therapies, how can you test it in the real world? Okay? RCT trials have not been designed for AI. So in order to get FDA approval for an algorithm and so on, it's very difficult because there is no known procedures to simply test these things. Okay? So what we have proposed is, again, something called a shadow trial, which is ethically sometimes questionable. But the idea is that the doctors do their own thing. They keep doing their own thing. But an AI is running in the background, also doing the diagnosis. So a doctor looks at ECG, let's say, and he gives you a decision, and the whole cycle continues as it. But at the same time, the AI also makes the diagnosis. Then you wait for 6 months. At the end of 6 months, you know, for bad outcomes or good outcomes or whatever, you know if the decisions made earlier was the right one or not. Then you compare the decisions made by the doctor and decisions made by the AI and see who was better. Sounds like, yeah, that sounds the way it should go. But not easy to get approval for that because you have all kinds of questions. Like, if you know that that person has cancer and the doctor diagnosed it as benign tumor, is it your responsibility as an AI company to say something or to ask the doctor for a second opinion? But then if you trigger that second opinion to the doctor gets biased. So we're getting there, but getting an approval for even a simple sort of shadow trial like that is not easy. Okay? So the last one I want to touch upon in this section is accountability for the block. So did you have a lecture on interpretability this week, last week? What is that? A little bit on interpret. So we will talk a lot about it in the second session. But here, the idea is that there are a couple of issues. One, modern machine learning systems are pretty much a black box even today, right? But it is not, you have to distinguish two things. It is not that the doctors need to know how it works, because the doctors don't know how an MRI machine works, how a CT scan works. They don't know. But Philips or GE or anybody else who builds these scanners, they know exactly the physics behind the MRI scanner. If something goes wrong, they know exactly what the problem is. They design the hell out of the system. So they know everything about it. In the same way, when it comes to AI, it's not that the doctor should be able to interpret. The doctors can just see the result and continue with their work. But the company or the researchers that build the system should know how it works. And that is not easy for two things. One, technically, it's not easy. The second half, we'll go into some ways of doing it. And the other issue is that many companies, when they have a model, they say it's proprietary model. Which means what now? Which means that they will not allow any third party to interrogate the model. Now, it's a complicated problem, because then we don't trust them. Okay, you say, no way. I mean, you will say whatever to sell your software, we're not going to use it. But on the other hand, if they allow people to interrogate, it's not like a hardware system. It's not like MRI. You cannot protect your patents and things like that. Somebody looks at your model, they can replicate it overnight. Okay? So the companies are also in a dilemma, right? Like, how do you do that? So that's also a complex problem. So I'll give you an example of an interesting, you know what are scribes? So, many of you are young, hopefully you've not gone to the doctor too many times, but when you go to the doctor, he sometimes, at least in our part of the world, they speak into a little mic and it automatically gets transcribed to the notes. So now that sounds like a great idea, right? So you don't need to type every time. You can look at the patient, you can just talk to the patient, and automatically in the background, like meeting notes or whatever, it takes notes for you, organizes it in a nice structured way, and puts it into the electronic health record. Sounds like it's going to be very helpful for the clinicians, and all the clinicians are going to use it. But the truth is, not really. There are two systems that they trialed. One is called the DAX Copilot in Nabla. And the study that they did came up with these results, right? So time and note for the two systems, that means they literally reduce the time to take the notes by 10%. 10% is a lot. It adds up with hundreds of patients that you see. I mean, the second system, not so much. Mini-Z and task load, these are sort of markers of increase in primary is the time to note, is a direct measure, and secondary outcomes like burnout, fatigue, and all of that, that also reduced, okay? Kind of. But it's okay, but the problem is there was a lot of caveats in this. First one, what we talked about. In this amazing trial where you're supposed to save time and help the doctors with their cognitive load doing the boring work, 15% of the physicians never even used it. Why? Because they said they've been typing, they know shorthands for the codes and all that, so not bothering with the mic. You can't force them. Second is that, but this was a while ago, these things get better. This is an AI problem that is because of different accents and different pronunciations. You may not get all the medical terms right? But this is now a solved problem, the inaccuracy of that transcribing. When I say time in note, they say how long it takes to write was captured, but what was not captured was how long it takes to edit any mistakes that they see in the app. That will also reduce. And the other big issue is, of course, that it was done only in one place in a couple of hospitals in the US, only in English and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of improvement. So this one AI tool, which was supposed to be a no-brainer, also was not an easy win when it came to healthcare. So, argument again stands. This is the models are ready. The system we are building is not ready for the sort of the AI revolution we are supposed to see, or we were promised. Okay, so I want to talk to. See, nowadays it's always difficult to say, what kind of jobs are you going to do? Big issue, right? Like, it's not trivial. Like, you see that a lot of things are getting automated. Software engineering to a large degree, data science to a large degree. So what kind of jobs are you going to do? So I'm going to speak to what I think, if you want to stay in this field, two kinds of people. Right? One are system thinkers. You got to become people who think not about a specific problem, but how to integrate many solutions to build entire systems. And a great opportunity in healthcare are what I like to call healthcare AI product managers. So if you want to be a product manager nowadays, you need to have quite some technical skills. With all the wipe coding and stuff, you should be able to create some kind of a mock-up, not even a mock-up, it's sort of POC on your own, but at the same time, the ability to think in terms of systems. And all the gaps that I showed you was a failure of, I would say, researchers or companies to think in terms of systems. You're only thinking, oh, this ECG data, I can predict this, benchmark, boom, publication, NeurIPS, ICLR, God, awesome. No use, absolutely no use. Because if you don't understand these gaps, you're not making any progress to society, or you're not making money. So there's no point. So this is a good opportunity to specialize in a domain, whatever. It need not be medicine per se. It could be almost any other. So I work a lot on various things like agriculture and space technology and all the things. You get some expertise in that domain, and you think about things in terms of systems and solving real problems and finding out what these different factors are, and then embedding AI solution in that and slowly thinking about behavioral change in people using this as well. So that's that. And it's halfway through. We'll switch to the second part. It's a complete shift. So maybe I should drink some water. Now you need to reset your mind. Close your eyes, reset. Any questions in the meantime? Yes.
About the owner part, do you think that hospital needs to reorganize themselves and start having an IT department, for example, in the second gap about computing, you said that most hospitals do not have an IT department that are able to build that infrastructure. And of course, as this model start to get better, the AI, they also has to get more complex and complex. I will need the dedication for a dedicated personnel for managing them. So it should be like the company that's building the one should be responsible, or should hospitals start getting and considering an IT department and hiring people to be in charge of that models? Because again, it's a high-risk scenario and needs to be like people that react very fast and iterate really fast on this and to solve problems.
Yeah, good question. So the answer depends on the scale of the hospital. If some hospitals are very large, massive hospitals, like the one I work with in Doha, we see about 2 million patients a year, Hamad Medical. Now, in a large hospital system like that, they can afford to start thinking about a dedicated team. They have the resources, they have the funding, because the ROI is not so quick. You need some time for it to realize. But there are, most hospitals in the world are small hospitals. They cannot afford to have their own IT team doing inference. So for that, there is a gap for a startup to build infrastructure, inference infrastructure within healthcare. It's a great opportunity, saying, okay, don't worry, we bring our stuff, computers, GPUs, racks. You don't need like a server room, right? Even if it's a medium-sized hospital, even if you have a rack of this size, you're done for a hospital with maybe 100,000 patients a year, which is a pretty large hospital. So it's great. You come up with your system, integrate it into the IT system, and do all sort of a white glove service for integrating this into that. I think it's a no-brainer. It's a great opportunity. There might be some companies trying to do it, but if you want to do that, you partner with one hospital, do that well, and just replicate that across hospitals. It's a great opportunity.
At some point, you mentioned that the insurance companies are not willing to pay for the AI.
Right.
Yeah, the AI
Use of AI,
procedures.
yeah.
But that sounds very strange to me because they are the first to use AI to assess the risk of somebody they are going to,
Exactly.
of clients, and what are
Yeah.
they going to.
So insurance companies also come with different levels of sophistication. So, for example, in Amsterdam, there's one insurance company that would give you smartwatches for free. And they'll reduce your insurance premium depending on the number of steps and the activities you do. Okay, so if you're more active, if you do more stuff, they will reduce your risk. Okay, it's a bit controversial, but anyway. But the insurance companies, they are not AI gurus. And they don't, and it's a old system, most of this. So if there is no code, once they see this, over time it's going to change for sure. Because if they see, and it also depends on sort of false positives as well. So if you treat somebody for sepsis, it's kind of expensive to treat them. Now you have to do a study to show that you treat all that AI says is going to have sepsis in 4 hours' time, and look at the amount of money you spent, and then look at the reduction in the sepsis cases over time, make this So there are insurance companies working for each of these problems separately, and once they're convinced, it takes now, it's going to be faster. So one histopathology kind of similar thing got a CPT code after 2 years. But the second code, they got it after 6 months. So that education is happening, okay? And that is going to be faster. I mean, these things are obviously moving really fast in the US. Here in Europe, it's a bit slower for all kinds of reasons, because the insurance structure also is different. A lot of public money goes into that. But this is a problem that will be solved, yeah, because there is money. Once they see that AI actually saves money at scale, they will obviously adopt. But now, the gap still exists, yeah?
Just I have a question. Do you think that the AI will make the medical services cheaper, or because I think now it's expensive compared to for example, United States, or what do you think about the AI in the healthcare cost?
Again, the idea is that overall, it's going to make it cheaper, definitely. Okay, overall, it will make it cheaper. There's lots of arguments for that. One is that I'll talk a little bit about that soon, but not only cheaper, but you know that just like when you go to fix a bridge, it's better to do maintenance continually than wait for the bridge to crack. Same happens with humans as well, right? It's better to use AI, and we work on a lot on that, to maintain good health before and delay the time that you need to reach the hospital. And that, if you can delay it by 1-2 years at the level of the population, we are talking about billions of dollars saved, right? So AI is going to make healthcare in general quite, in the immediate future, it might make it a bit expensive, but then eventually it'll make it. Okay, let's move on to the second topic. So here we want to get into, so how many of you work on machine learning theory? Theory of machine learning, and building new models, thinking about the mathematics behind why some of these things work, and so on and so forth. Yeah. So what I want to do is give you a way to think about some design principles that are derived from the knowledge of how the models try to represent things, especially what they call the foundation models. And once you have that, I think you can design systems for healthcare in a very safe and at the intuitive and an interpretable manner. Okay, so why geometry? Okay. Because I'm going to assume a few things, but please let me know if anything doesn't make sense. Okay, so what we're going to do in this part is, and stop me, we don't need to go all the way through, is define or sort of try to intuitively understand what are representations of objects, text, images inside, I'll just call it the brain, inside the brain of an AI model. How can we use that geometry? Okay, how to understand, how to unpack the geometry, and how to use that geometry. A very cool trick that our brain does, so we go a little bit into the neuroscience, on linearization. What does that mean? Then we will go into some of the more, in-trend models now and see what those models are doing. Reasoning models, you've heard of reasoning models. World models, how many have heard of world models? Yeah, world models. And grounding based on ontologies. So how are these things shaping representations, and how should we understand representations? Okay, well, good. Take this slowly. So you think about it like this, okay? The mental model that you need to work with is the following. A patient is not just a point in, so when you, just assume any kind of data, you're taking imaging data, you're taking electronic health record, you're taking ECG, some input modality, doesn't matter what it is, goes through one of these foundation models, and there is an embedding layer, right? At dimension 1,000, 2,000 dimensional vector, essentially. This 2,000 dimensional space has one point, but you should not think of anything, not only a patient, but we will ground everything to healthcare, but even if it's video or whatever. Any image should not be part of one point in space, but you have to think about a patient as a trajectory in this n-dimensional space. Okay, let's just think about that, okay? Trajectory in n-dimensional space. It's basically a curve that you draw through this 1,000-dimensional space. Now, the problem, it sounds easy, right? No, it is easy to think about it that way. Why do we need that? Because if we have a continuous space, why do we need to do any machine learning, essentially? So to figure out what that patient is going to become, maybe 1 year from now, or what is he going to become after a particular therapy is given to him or her, right? So then if you trace this through that, you can move it through that trajectory and then decode it and see, steering that patient through that trajectory to see, okay, this is going to help, this is not going to help. You run a simulation in the brain of the AI, right? Now, why, you know that our brain doesn't, obviously, if you think about it, doesn't look at anything in isolation. So let me tell you a small story that will trigger a little bit of a strange response in your brain. I'm going to do an experiment, okay? So I went to the lake the other day, and I had a very nice swim. It was very nice, cold water, very nice swim. But then I came back and I was totally wet, so I had to dry myself. So I dried myself with a piece of glass. Now, everything was going fine, right? The representation, what you were doing is a sort of visualization of what was happening, okay? Lake, bath, wet, everything made sense because it was going through a smooth trajectory in your frontal cortex. Everything was fine. But suddenly, when I dried myself with a piece of glass, you thought, this guy is crazy, right? There was a mismatch in your trajectory and the input signal that came in, right? This comes under the sort of domain of predictive coding as well. So we automatically always deal with trajectories when we want to understand stuff. So much so that you've seen all kinds of amazing developments happening in robotics. So we're talking about this today. Robots are doing a lot of cool stuff. But if I take any one of you and say, come on, let's move this table, it's easy. You hold that end, I hold this end, and we move the table. Sounds trivial. We ask two robots with all the advanced technologies to do it now, two. They will struggle. Why do they struggle? Because they do not have a mental representation of the other person in their own head. Okay? When you do stuff, you do anything. If you are like going to grasp something, if I see you do that, I am running most of the commands to grasp, except sending my arm to grasp that object. Okay? You feel this very, very well if you are, watching a football game, as an example, and you have, it's an intense moment, and you are, I don't know, your favorite team is right next to the goal, and he's going to kick, and your leg sometimes automatically does this motion without you voluntarily doing it. Why does that happen? Because that inhibition of your motor cortex, you're so much in the moment that the code keeps running forward without that stop signal, right? And this is very important for people who don't have this. Are literally, there's one of the papers that we wrote, are psychopaths. It was a very dangerous experiment we did with a couple of serial killers back in Social Brain Lab, but you can read all about it on BBC at some point. So trajectory is very important. If you look at any, this is an internal representation cast down to a low dimension for you to visualize from the Llama model. Okay, so Llama large language models. And if you look at these, days of a week, age, temperature, they're not randomly scattered. Even in this low dimensional representation, it has some structure. So what you're looking at is a low dimensional representation of a 2000 dimensional, let's say, Llama internal representation. So you see that what it is actually doing is it's capturing the structure of these variables inside its representation. So it's not just randomly like having a representation of stuff here. There is some meaning in closeness in this representational space. Okay? And where does this structure come from? How does so it's next token prediction, essentially, right? LLMs. Where does this structure come from? We are feeding it text, and there is structure in that text, all right? So if you look at certain things, Monday always comes, Sunday and Monday it usually comes together in a lot of the text, right? The order of days is usually maintained very well across all of the internet, all right? Think of that kind of structures. And these concepts get embedded in these kind of very interesting spaces. See, this is what I wanted to say, right? So real world has a lot of structure, and these structures are often captured in this representational space. Another question is, how can we use this understanding to better shape the representational space? So this is where you have to now start thinking, should I make the traces very complicated, or should I make the traces smooth so that I can travel along these smooth paths in an easy way? Okay? Let me see if I can pull up. Okay, well, just go through that. But sometimes it's things, okay, if you look at age in the previous things, or seasons, or salaries, you would think that these concepts should be mapped linearly, but they often are not mapped linearly, okay? And sometimes you will have to explicitly linearize it. And I'll tell you an example about where the brain does these things, okay? So the colored line is probably the space, the true underlying manifold. And the dotted line is a direct connection between these two. And if it's not linear, if you want to go, let's say, 1 year in one direction, you have to make sure that you travel along the geometry of the data. Otherwise, you will get absolute garbage, okay? Actually, what I wanted to show you was a little thing. Let me explain this a bit here, what we are looking at. This is okay, it takes a bit of concentration to understand what this actually is. Let me put this on. So you see the dotted lines there, okay? And what you see on top is that black thing that you see is a car between two, let's say, mountains. This is a classic, have you heard of the mountain car problem? When it comes to reinforcement learning, the mountain car problem is one of these kind of textbook problems. The idea is the following. You need to reach that target on top, okay? There's a car in the bottom. You need to reach the target on top, but the car doesn't have full throttle to go vroom up there. So you have to use gravity. How would you do it in real life? Like, you have little power, you go up, and then you leave the throttle, it goes back, but then it goes back up. And then you do vroom, it goes back up. Then you go back all the way up. And then like that you use gravity and a little bit of throttle to seesaw your way up to the target. Classic problem. Now, this model is called a vision action model. So vision action model, very much used in robotics as well, is given a frame, you perform an action. Okay? So you generate a frame, you perform an action. So this red line that you see is what it actually did. And the idea is, if you have linear steering versus probe steering. So when the car goes along the curve, you see two things happening. If you go along the manifold splines, you can see the car. That means it is a legitimate position in representational space. You can do it. This linear probe, the car sort of exists because the linear probe is this blue line. It is a point in representational space, but it is nowhere close to the data manifold. I mean, it's kind of close compared to the green one. Therefore, when the machine tries to generate an image, it generates a blurry image because it's not a real representation of a car in that slope. So the car starts to get blurrier. And in the other one, the linear probe, the probe steering, if you just represent the green, there's no car. You are hallucinating. So now you see that similar tricks, if you understand the data manifold and travel along the manifold, you get greater control. And one of the biggest problems with LLM these days is hallucination. It still hallucinates. Why does it hallucinate? Because it gets out of that manifold and then generates stuff which are not part of the data distribution. But this is an interesting philosophical question as well, because to be creative, you really need to be at the edge of chaos. You cannot always lie on the red, because that's like regurgitating whatever you've learned. You just pushing the data back. You can't go totally off script. So you need to have a little bit of noise around what you have learned so that you can ground yourself, snap back to reality, if you wish, but at the same time, able to steer towards a particular goal. Okay? I know this was not, I'm not sure whether I go into details about this. Yeah, so you could ask, how many of you know about autoencoders? Okay, and sparse autoencoders, right? So autoencoders what do? They typically have a bottleneck. They have an input, they have a representation space, but there is no control, unless you do some variational stuff, there's no control over what that representational geometry is like. Random images, you just give it, ask it to reconstruct the image. So what does it do? It shatters the representation space into clouds, into clusters, without any meaning of the manifold itself. It sort of misses all of those very nice connection points, smooth points. So sparse autoencoders are very useful for many things, but it doesn't necessarily learn smooth trajectories through the space. LLMs initially were not designed for this, because something about the structure of languages helped them to maintain that, because we speak and write, hopefully, in sort of coherent manners. That structure has gone into this. You can also see that if you train videos, the representations are much more smooth than it is now. So I spoke briefly about this, right? So a lot of the processes that happen in our brain are nonlinear. A lot of things is happening. But the interesting thing is they do all these complex nonlinear work to then end up in the motor cortex, which is around here, to deliver signals which are very linear. So for the mathematicians in you, they are almost like Lipschitz functions. So little changes, if the glass is slightly off, if it's here or if it's here, I shouldn't be running completely two different programs. I should be able to adjust the program a little bit to get hold of my bottle, right? So, which means that finally, in the motor cortex, the representations need to be linearized. Perceptual straightening is a very interesting concept in neuroscience, and a lot of work has been done. And only very recently, only in the last few months, honestly, have real efforts been taken to design representational spaces to have this property. And I think fascinating, and this is something that I think about a lot and start to work on. This will have very, very fascinating outcomes going forward. So, world models. Some of you said you know what world models are, right? So, I'll give you a brief sort of 1-minute explanation of what are world models, and then think about them as well, sort of in terms of representations. So next word predictions, LLMs, what do? Input goes a bunch of tokens, and it comes with some outputs, and you mask the next token, and you reveal the mask, and you backpropagate the error to sort of train a machine to predict the next token. But the token is predicted in input space. token, what you're predicting is also a word. What you're inputting is also a word. Now, you know that you're looking at stuff. I can see all of you, but my brain is not processing most of it, right? Because it's capturing, if there's some change in the wall, I don't pay attention to that. But that signal is coming in. But when you do vanilla machine learning, deep learning, what you do, you put in all the pixels into the image and say, reconstruct. Okay. And you reconstruct everything, every pixel on that wall, on this wall, all of your faces. Most of the, like 95% of the information is irrelevant. If it changes, the meaning of the scene doesn't change. If the colors of your seat changes, the meaning that you're sitting and listening doesn't change. Hopefully you're listening, but anyway. So how do you capture that? Is by compressing the scene. And what's the best way to compress a scene? By putting it into embedding space. So what you do, essentially, is take the context, which you think of this as like image, or most of the image, embed that, and then predict the rest of the masked image, not directly, but in encoded space. So a 2000 dimensional vector in the embedded space predicts another 2000 dimensional vector, which when decoded should produce something like the scene that you're seeing. So your prediction is happening between, not between input spaces, but between two encoders. Now, if you think about it, what is it doing? Now that you have, I don't know if you have one slide on that. No. So now that we've done some exercise thinking about these representation spaces, what do you think the world models are doing? It's starting from one representation, predicting the next representation. So you can think of that as creating some kind of a velocity vector along the direction of sort of the geodesics, along the direction of data. All right? So it, by design, is trying to predict the edges. And if you design this predictor, and a paper came out like 2 weeks ago, if you design this predictor well, then you can go through very, very nice trajectories between these embedding space and get linearized spaces, which is very easy to navigate, to interpret, to manipulate, to steer. You can do, you finally start to get real control. Reasoning. You know, when did this happen? So reasoning models are now about 10 months old, right? About 10 months old. So what is a reasoning model? Anybody? Reasoning models in like simple terms. Yeah.
It's an LLM that has been fine-tuned or adapted via reinforcement learning to iterate over a problem in order to provide the best answer.
Correct. So exactly, it iterates, it bootstraps over its own output. You give it a problem, ask it to think about it. What it really does is bootstraps starting from the representation space. So it takes your input, finds the embedding. That embedding is decoded and put it back into the algorithm, right? You don't need to, and it does it many times. What does it do then? So it slowly nudges that in a direction along the data manifold. So it's not just acting on a snapshot. It is looking for the gradients along the data manifold. Okay? So the reasoning smoothens out the trajectory or the traces. It's called a trace. So if you go to ChatGPT, ask it to think, if you click on the drop down, you can see the thinking process, right? It's sort of, if you want, you can see how it's thinking. And each of those steps that you see that it's thinking is different representations. And if you plot that out in a low dimensional space, you will see a smooth curve. Not just one point, boom, answer, no. And that, obviously, because of the law of averages and all of these things, gives you a much more coherent answer. Because first time somebody asks you a question, you think about it. If you just give out an answer without really planning it out, you also get it wrong, right? Because you are not traveling through that smooth manifold. So this is, like I said, the world model that we talked about is actually a model of edges in representation spaces. Okay? And that's very interesting. Now, this is something that we work in our lab very much as well, is a grounding or ontology. So I said the LLMs are now getting really good at understanding the structure of the input data. If you have enough input data, and input data has some structure. So what if we explicitly structure the input data? How can you explicitly structure the input data? Is that you create knowledge graphs, or more carefully, ontologies. Like, if I have a patient, as an ontology you can construct, which says that if he has type 2 diabetes, and if he's connected to a CGM, CGMs are these patches, you might have seen people having these patches that give you glucose monitoring kind of thing, that can be used as a marker for HbA1c, that's your sugar level. If that is above 5.5, 6, you are pre-diabetic. If that's above 8, you're diabetic, okay? So you know this from a lot of the knowledge that's been synthesized. What if you give this as input structure to your model? What then happens is that it starts to create representations that mimic this structure that is there in that, along with the other benefits that come from training a large model. That is, it's able to combine many different patients, many different kinds of medicines, their atomic structures, and so on and so forth. Okay, so this is one way, and you have to look up something called Optimus KG. It's a fantastic sort of, again, very, very recent ontology for medicine that's come out of MIT. It's open source. You can use it to structure your data in a way that is more amenable to sort of advanced analysis. So now this is all all the rage, right? Agentic AI, everybody's doing agentic, yeah. Why would you want to do agentic workflow sometimes, right? So again, what I'm trying to say is that instead of giving you facts, I want you to start building a representation of how to think in this space of models, or the model's brain. So if you can play around with that, you'll see how neatly this fits in to that as well. So if you have a complex task, if you get a big model like GPT-5 or whatever, Claude, whatever, that's trained on all kinds of things. And it's great because you can almost ask any question, it gives you an answer. But, you don't want a healthcare LLM to answer which team is going to win the next World Cup, right? That's not the aim. You need to constrain that space, right? And what happens when you constrain that space? First of all, you can build much smaller models, right? What we often now refer to as SLMs, megabyte-sized models, or 1 billion parameter models. So what it's doing is that if you control it in a way, so you just need one LLM which actually knows how to divide the task, and each of these agents are much smaller, doing one specific task, only good in radiology, only good in notes, only good in something. What can you do? Again, if you go back to the space of representations, what it's really doing is giving each agent a clean representational space to work on. It need not combine football with healthcare. It can focus just on healthcare related stuff and create a representation which is much smoother because it need not think about very different things. Same thing is very difficult for one person to do very, very different tasks, right? You can't be Usually, you can't be a good football player and a mathematician at the same time. So different tasks require different things. And what's happening really is that representation is being cast in a smaller boundary. And then what really happens is this. When you have a big planning agent and many small agents, each agent has its own manifold in which it runs its representation. But this explicit edges that we give sort of has an opportunity to combine this, and that's where basically human design comes into picture, right? So you let the agents do a domain-specific complex task, reading radiology image or electronic health record, and then explicitly ask it to combine this in a different system, okay? So what this allows you to do is really don't mix up representational spaces, okay? So the idea again is, if you don't take anything from this talk, remember that if you think about a lot of things in terms of these representations, you can do a lot of fun stuff. And the final is very interesting. This paper, I don't know how many of you know this paper. In 2019, it was the top paper at Neuroscience, the most prestigious AI conference these days. And the idea was, how many of you know about ResNets? Okay, so if you take a ResNet, this paper showed that ResNet is essentially solving a differential equation. Okay, so if you write down how, if you have these kind of skip connections, what it does when the transformed data and the skip connection comes together is look at the difference, okay, so the delta, which is essentially a differential equation, and that function is your neural network, okay? And why is this useful? Again, ResNets were really interesting because if you look at the representations at different levels, it's a smooth trajectory, okay? It's all about smoothness, it's all about geometry. So if you can then cast this as a differential equation by definition works on functions that are smooth, okay? That are differentiable, integrable functions, right? So what happens if you design a neural network in this way? And why is that very useful for healthcare? Is that healthcare, unlike videos and stuff, are very scattered data. You go to the hospital to do all kinds of tests in a week. Then, thank God, you probably don't need to go there for like 2 years, 3 years. Then you go again, you do a few tests here and there. Very, very irregularly sampled data. Which means that if you go to the first point of thinking about a patient as a trajectory, you're like, here, a bunch of points, and then nothing. Then a bunch of points. Extremely irregular, extremely noisy, right? So imagine if you can fit a differential equation, essentially, to find a trajectory or find a manifold. Whenever you get that data, you just need to project it onto the manifold. And that's what these people did in something called an ODE RNN, ordinary differential equation, recurrent neural networks, to fit time series of electronic health records over time on completely irregularly sampled data. Okay? So you don't need a grid of regularly sampled times to do many of these things. And this worked beautifully. Again, getting back to the point, it worked because differential equations need to be smooth. Representations, therefore, are intrinsically designed to be smooth. So, same point, right? The electronic health records are not clean like video frames. They are not coming in regular intervals. They are messy. What happens when it's messy? It's what you saw in the very first slides when I was trying to do that demo, is that when there is noise, you can think about the representations like going slightly off the manifold. But you can literally fill that up by snapping it back onto the manifold. Okay? And a very sophisticated way to do this, now common way to do this is diffusion models, which will become very prominent in the near future, combined with techniques like this. So, yeah, this is essentially what I said. So, idea is that think of it, going back to things. The patient is not a point, it's a trajectory. And when you want to understand that, you need to understand how representations in these models travel over time. Don't consider each input as distinct, but somehow connected. And your job is to make that connections in representation spaces, whether it's world models or grounding in graphs or ordinary differential equation based modeling or explicit linearization of the output space for better control. And this is, so a lot of the examples I gave were again snapping back to healthcare. But there is none of this what I told now is only for healthcare. It works amazingly well in robotics, right? These same ideas. I'll give a whole talk on that. But here, before I end, I want to tell you that one thing that we're really working on is helping people stay healthy. And it's a bit of a double-edged sword. I'll explain why. And because if we manage to get your representation, you as an individual in that embedding space, which will happen sooner or later, if we gather your data from your smartwatch, from the conversation you're having and so on, we can build an extremely good representation of you. And all the activities that you do, you are going to travel along a very smooth manifold, which is good in one side, because then if you're not doing things healthy, we can think of ways to intervene and steer you, but not by saying, oh, walk 10,000 steps. Okay, most people are not going to do it. But if you do the same nudge in a very sort of personalized way, for example, if you're staying somewhere here, and if your heart rate is going up, and the nudge comes, oh, there's a staircase in this. Just go up the staircase, look at those mountains for like 30 seconds and come back. Very personalized, knowing exactly where you are, how you are, and you nudge that person, you will snap that person back into what we call a good state. But I don't need to tell you what else we can do, right? And there's a reason why sometimes we'll have to say no to some of the folks who want to work with you, because the same thing can be used to take you in a direction far from anything good, and you won't even know, because the nudges from multimodal data will be so small that you won't realize that you're going away from that manifold. Okay? So behavioral change is a very powerful application of understanding these representations. But like any good technology, we can change it for the good or for the bad. But I hope that this gave you a little bit of intuition how to think of design in representation spaces. I hope convinced you that AI is more close to reality in healthcare than it's a hype. We just need to engineer the system better, right? Thank you. That's good.
Thanks. Very interesting view. Comment, question, please? Yes. One moment.
First of all, thank you very much. A really interesting talk. I have a question, and it's that I read a lot about interpretability, especially, and I am been thinking about the part of grounding the knowledge and understanding the latent state of our models. And the thing is that one thing that they said is when models start to get big, it's like you cannot expect to. We as humans have concepts around the world, but these models, by learning from the data, may have developed different concepts. And so there is a lot of the time a problem when you try to find a concept that makes sense for us, for example, the concept of a chair, and maybe the model has not that concept. And so it can deceive us to say, oh, okay, so this manifold or this subspace encodes the chair thing, but the model is not really doing that. So, and also if we enforce an structure on the latent space, that can also lead to poorer performance because it's not suitable for the task or for the architecture we're using. So how do you address this problem?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think it depends on the application. So there are startups now working on making AI more creative. Okay, so really AI to generate hypotheses, scientific hypotheses to work on. In those cases, you have to let the model build representations which are not as controlled as you would like. So it's okay. It finds some weird things. You can go off the manifold, hallucinate, because hallucination is not a bad thing, by the way, right? It's a bad thing when you act on it without thinking. But hallucination is really where the creativity comes, where it tries to combine many different points in representative space to come up with a new concept, new idea. So if you're working in that field, then great. Then we don't constrain, we don't enforce structures on latent spaces so much. But if you're working on control, on robotics, there are certain motions that the robot needs to follow, not to hurt itself, because there are some joints that it cannot do, some actions it should not do, or if it's close to a human, it should behave differently. If it's in another environment, it should behave differently. Then you need much more control. So your choice of when to constrain, when to linearize, what to linearize really depends. That's why this is very interesting. These agentic things are starting to become interesting, because if you decouple some of these problems, joint motions, you can say has to be constrained over certain manifolds. And that we know exactly what manifolds, because it comes from geometry, Euler angles, and so on and so forth, which manifolds it has to go through. Whereas if it is trying to figure out the shortest path to something, you can let it think about how to do that motion. So you have a different module to think about motion, other to think about planning. So you can put less constraints on one, more constraints on the other. And when you want to let it go off the manifold, you should. But healthcare, certain things you need more control. You have to make sure that it adheres not too far away from what we know works.
Yeah, but in that case where you have these 10 models and you constrain each model, even at a space, to only work about a certain thing or certain concept, then you start to losing the ability of thinking or reasoning across different concepts or different areas, which is a key part that, for example, a medical expert will have. He will have knowledge about different areas of medicine, and even if he tends to treat a given disease, can say, okay, so you should go to this other department, or could be happening, or there is stuff going cross happening.
Exactly. So I agree. So this is when that kind of architecture where you have modules doing certain things independently, but then you have a composer module. The composer module then gets input. So each agent has done its job, traveling and reasoning in its space, but the composer module then combines these different concepts from these different fields and then gives you a synthesized. Instead of this one model trying to go through all these complicated dimensional spaces, it lets each one of them do, and then when you combine it, the composer then has that information from these different sectors. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I like how to use geometry to understand what's going on inside the models. My question is any agent, or it can give us traditional path or paths that exist in the database or the data set. How we can, but as a human, we have inspiration. For example, CNN was inspired by how eyes work. Diffusion models was inspired in thermodynamics. How we can define the inspiration in the models, or how we can make models more as you said, creative. And another question: we are seeing a vector or a point that we learn this point. Maybe later we can calculate these shapes, these manifolds, rather than train on a data set. What do you think about that?
Yeah, okay, good question. So let me explain a few things. So when I say designing the representational spaces, right, there are intuitions that you can have on how that space should be distributed. You can explicitly control the distribution and the intrinsic dimensionality if you want. For example, if you have things that are planning that is hierarchical, a lot of data is hierarchical in nature. So say I want this system to reason in a hierarchical sense. From mathematics, we can have the intuition that this space should be Riemannian geometry, okay, in spirit. So you can enforce a Riemannian manifold over this space and say you constrain these points to stay on that manifold, okay? And then if you worked in the field, then it's we know the calculus of going on Riemannian manifolds. So if you structure that, and if you know that the problem requires hierarchical thinking, that is, you do one job, and then based on the output of that job, you do the other two jobs, and you have that sequence in mind. This is very useful for diagnosis. You say you have one of these two big problems, and then you go to that and say, okay, in this, I think you have more, gastroenteritis kind of problems. Then you go there, and then they will say something else. There's a lot of decision making is hierarchical. You don't make the decision; you make a set of decisions. So you can put and superimpose a different geometric structure on the space to this. But okay, this will get on to some sort of politics and stuff like that. The idea is that if you constrain these spaces very well, you can beat scaling laws. How many of you heard of scaling laws? Scaling laws basically says more compute you throw with more data, the models just keep getting better. This is one of a very nice but also very terrible paper from OpenAI. And that's why those kind of literally trillions of dollars now spent on data centers, massive compute, and so on and so forth. So the incentive to continue finding geometries or representation spaces just through data is there. Superimposing intelligent design on representational spaces will reduce the compute requirement by orders of magnitude. And that is not liked by a lot of the big companies, obviously. Okay, so there's a little bit of that thing as well to keep in mind. AI has gone out of the academic realm now, so it's a systems thinking.